This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Erik Prince, author of Civilian Warriors, the inside story of Blackwater and the unsung heroes of the War on Terror. Erik, tell us, what is Blackwater and who are these unsung heroes?
You know, I started the business after I was in the SEAL teams. My father died. My wife was sick with cancer, so I got out earlier than I wanted to, and I wanted to start a business that would stay close to SEAL teams and support them. Special operations units like that have been using private facilities since the 70s, but no one had done it on a grand scale. And I was in an unusual position to do that. So we bought the land, started a training facility. It was kind of an early field of dreams. And one thing led to another. You know, the Columbine tragedy, two bad kids shooting up a school. We ended up training thousands of police officers after that, how to protect and prevent active shooters. After the coal was blown up, we trained thousands and thousands of Navy sailors how to protect their ship. And then, of course, after 9/11, we were asked by the U.S. government to come and help in a lot of more overseas activity. We did a lot of training, a lot of logistics support, aviation support, and, of course, high-end executive security. We're really a gap filler. We're a services contractor that would perform on a competitively big contract to assist the government in whatever it is they needed done.
You called it a field of dreams. It's more like a swamp of dreams, wasn't it? You guys set up in the Great Dismal Swamp. What is the Great Dismal Swamp, and where is it, and what do you guys do there?
It's a big swamp. It's a bunch of flat land. Oddly enough, it was originally surveyed by George Washington hundreds of years ago. And we bought a big chunk of flat land with enough land to catch any stray bullets. And we built the ranges, literally hacked it out of nothing. The term Blackwater came from the water that was in the ditches. As we were putting in culverts and building out the facility, our legs were being dyed dark brown to black from the peat in the water. And so thus the name was born, and the logo of that bear paw came from the bears coming out of the woods and ripping their claws into the power poles as we put in the infrastructure.
Why does the military need private security contractors? Why can't the armed forces handle these projects on their own?
Anytime the U.S. military does something, for example, the U.S. military did an amazing job in rolling from Kuwait to Baghdad in the invasion of Iraq, but taking that conventional mechanized brigade and turning it to be now a stability or a counterinsurgency force creates some gaps because they can't retask everyone perfectly. And so if you have a gap for executive security, or you need more laundry done, or food prepared, or mail delivered, those are the kind of gaps that private contractors can quickly rush into the gap and fill. And if the government needs them for a little while, they hire them. And then when the need goes away, the cost goes away because the cost goes to zero. It's just like when you rent a car, you need it for a weekend, you rent it, and when you're done, you turn it back in, and it's done. Really, the private sector has been supporting the U.S. military literally since the very founding of the republic. Even in the War of Independence, you have contractors that came and built the Continental Army and fought side by side with the Patriots in the War of Independence.
Critics of Blackwater say that its employees are or were mercenary soldiers, and this is the privatization of the military. Is that a fair criticism?
No, it's really inaccurate. It's a kind of a cheap political ploy. The fact is, our guys were veterans. Veterans that had already served America as active duty in the military or in law enforcement, where they acquired those skills, and then they volunteered again to go and serve the country through a private contractor like Blackwater to do a dangerous mission. And 41 of our men were killed doing that job, serving America. They were Americans working for America in an American contingency. If they want to criticize and trash the name of a mercenary, well, then they need to just start ripping up some monuments in Washington, D.C., because as I was saying before, guys like Lafayette, Rochambeau, Von Steuben, Kosciuszko, those were mercenaries. They were professional contractors that came and built the Continental Army and helped America gain its independence.
You have a line late in the book, Civilian Warriors, where you write, "When it comes to Blackwater, if I had to do it all over again, I'm not sure I would," unquote. Why do you say that?
Well, you know what? I never started the business to I never really intended to be a defense contractor. I intended to be a great training area to serve the SEAL teams and to serve that community. We grew exponentially because we kept saying yes and performing well on what the government asked. Pouring all of your time, talent, treasure into something for 13 years and then literally have it kind of ripped down surely by politics, by bureaucratic attack in trial lawyers. It's quite frustrating to see that happen. So I'm not sure that I would do it again. I certainly would not work for the State Department. They were the source of, I would say, 95% of the challenges we faced.
What's the difficult misunderstanding?
It's difficult serving a customer that will leave you hanging.
What's the biggest misunderstanding that the public has about Blackwater?
The biggest misperception is that the guys were running their own operations and going rogue and with no oversight. They operated, the company operated under competitively bid 1,000-page contract with very clear rules of engagement, how the men would dress, where they would go, the kind of experience required, the psych evaluations required before even employing them. All those things, the State Department told them where to drive, how to drive, what speed to drive, practically. All through. So it was definitely a State Department-run mission. Second, that they were trigger-happy. We did more than 100,000 missions protecting diplomats. No one under our care was ever killed or injured. Vigilance matters. Good diplomatic security matters. And I can say with high assurance that if Blackwater had been on the job, then the ambassador in Libya, in Benghazi, would still be alive.
You're the founder of Blackwater. You're also its former CEO. You saw the military up close for a long time. What is the state of the U.S. military right now? Is it strong? Is it weakening? What do you see?
I would say the quality of our soldiers, the average soldier, is better than anywhere in the world. They're fantastic. Our NCOs are second to none. The junior officers, fantastic. I think as you get towards the top of the military, things grow more bureaucratic, and the military has become very top-heavy. We have more Navy admirals than we have ships. So there isn't, I make the point that towards the end of the book, it's important, believe it or not, to cut the defense budget and the intelligence budget because it's become so large, so bloated that it becomes incapable of agility in any quick or decisive action. Paring it down, making it leaner will make it truly not just effective, but much more cost effective. And it takes away the argument from the left, because the left wants to protect social programs, the right wants to protect defense. I say cut it all. There's plenty of room to cut on the right.
You live part-time in Abu Dhabi. What are you doing there?
I've started a private equity fund, and we invest private money in energy, mining, agriculture, logistics opportunities throughout Africa. We're kind of taking the know-how that we built in operating in places like Afghanistan, building a police base under fire where we trained thousands and thousands of Afghan border police. We're taking that know-how and taking it to Africa of how to operate and make your logistics flow on time in some very challenging places. Africa has great opportunities, but you have to know what you're doing in the process.
As you gaze across the Persian Gulf and think about Iran, what do you see? Is Iran a threat? Should we be worried about where that country's headed? Any country that the people in Iran make Persian rugs, in a country that's deliberate enough to sew a rug that they're putting 1,000 stitches into a square inch. They're a very plodding, deliberate, and patient people. The fact is, Iran is very vulnerable. You have most of the population there, 70% under the age of 30. They don't want to live under, I call it a mulocracy, a crazy religious dictatorship. They want freedom. I think one of the great mistakes of the Obama administration is that the Arab Spring, per se, actually started in Persia in July of 2009. There was a couple million people in the streets all over Iran protesting, asking for freedom, and the U.S. said nothing. No moral support, no media support, and certainly no material support for people that were protesting against a regime extremely hostile to the West. But yet, Obama is very quick to basically throw under the bus Hosni Mubarak, a 30-year U.S. ally, and kind of throw Egypt into the jaws of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, thank goodness Egypt has taken itself back,
But a huge miss. Iran is dangerous. They're plotting. They want to dominate the entire region. It's amazing to see alleged cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia squaring off against Iran because they do see them as the menace that they are.
The author is Erik Prince. The book is Civilian Warriors, The Inside Story of Blackwater and the Unsung Heroes of the War on Terror. Thanks for listening. This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Charles Murray, author of The Curmudgeon's Guide to Getting Ahead, Do's and Don'ts of Right Behavior, Tough Thinking, Clear Writing, and Living a Good Life. Charles, what about and who's it for?
Well, I'll start with who it's for. It's for people who are making the transition from college to adult life, which I think is a treacherous transition because you can go wrong in a couple of ways. First thing is you can go directly to graduate school just because it's the line of least resistance and lock yourself into a career you hate. And the other reason is that you're in the workplace if you go directly into a job, and a lot of new college graduates know nothing about it. It started out as a lark. I was doing this for the younger staff at AEI and a series of tips, and somebody said, make it into a book. So I did.
The first section is called On the Presentation of Self in the Workplace. What's the biggest mistake young adults make when they show up for work at a place like the American Enterprise Institute?
Well, I'll tell you what's the biggest mistake with me, which is to use the word like 3 or 4 times in every sentence. I will have a hard time staying with, like a conversation like has any meaning whatsoever as far as concerned. So I'll write you off if you use the word like. There are a couple other things you ought to watch out for when you're first in the workplace. Among others, you really shouldn't show up with a tattoo that's visible or a piercing that's visible. Actually, you probably aren't going to get hired if you're interviewed by someone like me if you have those problems.
So I guess you really are a curmudgeon, right? This is the Curmudgeon's Guide to Getting Ahead. Are you in fact a curmudgeon? I looked up the word, Charles. It's a bad-tempered, cantankerous person. Is that really you?
That sounds pretty. No, actually, the first part of the book is where I'm being a curmudgeon. I'm defining it more broadly to mean people of both genders and also of ages down to the 40s. Who are inwardly grumpy about some aspects of the contemporary culture. The rest of the book, I'm afraid I have to fess up and say I am more fatherly than curmudgeonly. But the first part of the book on presentation of self in the workplace, I'm really grumpy.
I think that's right. It does become fatherly after you get out of this section. But even in that section, it seems like no, you're just maintaining a certain kind of decorum, and you're not afraid to set rules and hope people live by them.
Yeah, you're stripping away the mask here, John. I've gone to great lengths to portray myself as a curmudgeon, and I look at the book, and it doesn't sound that much to me, that much that way. Yeah, in the first part, I'm also talking about problems that people have if they've never been in a advisor-subordinate relationship before. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the good old days, most kids who got their first job after college had been holding jobs as far back as 9 or 10 when they were delivering papers and had worked throughout high school and worked throughout college. You have a lot of kids who are going into the workplace for the first time, and what they see as oppressive, evil, unfair behavior, a lot of times is just the way the supervisors relate to subordinates, and they don't understand what that entails.
I've always thought one of the best things a kid can do before college or in college, go work at McDonald's or a place like that, and just learn about what the workplace is like. Learn about showing up on time, learning about being pleasant, about wanting to serve and do well. But we started to lose that, haven't we?
Yeah, I think that that is absolutely essential. There are a couple of things you take away from that. One is, I think everybody needs to have a job where something hurts at the end of the day. You've got to know what work is like, when it's physically painful. And if it's just your feet hurting because you've been standing up all day, that's good enough. Another thing that I want people to learn who are going to be on top for the rest of their lives is what it's like to be a wait person in a restaurant, to be a clerk in a store, because if you have done that, you will never be, the probability that you will be a jerk when you are eating in a restaurant or buying stuff in a store will go down.
Now, this book has several sections, and it has 35 points, recommendations or pieces of advice that you give. Number 19 is learn to love rigor. What do you mean by that?
I want people not only to say, oh, gee, I suppose I better check my numbers if you've prepared a memo for your boss, but to want to check the numbers. I want people, when there are 3 or 4 options that their boss told them to look into, I want them to be willing to end up wasting a lot of time, wasting in quotes, determining that 2 or 3 out of the 4 aren't a good idea. When I say that you've got to learn to love it, if you're doing it sort of because you feel you have to, you aren't going to do a very good job of it. If you want to be somebody who gets ahead, if you want to rise to the top of your craft, you have to love all the detail stuff. If you're a writer like I am, like you are, John, you've got to want to go over that draft again and again and again, making it perfect as possible. You got to want to do that.
Point number 21 is recalibrate your perspective on time. What are you saying there?
It's because you have people who are 21 years old, 22 years old, who think if they take a few years off and do something else, they're going to fall hopelessly behind everybody else. That's one of the ways I want them to recalibrate their perspective on time. The other way is don't think that you have to be a star by your late 20s and famous by your early 30s, or else something's wrong with your career. Here's something I put in the book that I hadn't thought about until I wrote it. When you were 22 years old, as many years separate you from the age of 40 as separate you from your 4th birthday party. And so it's natural when you're 22 years old to see the period in your 20s and 30s is stretching out indefinitely. I'm trying to get across the point that, you know what, it's in your 40s that you're going to be at the peak of your creative abilities and also at the peak of your expertise that you've acquired in learning your trade. And that's what you should think of as the period you're aiming at as the period where you're going to blossom.
Another bit of advice you have in here is you say something like, the best thing that can ever happen to you is a good marriage.
Yeah. I'm 1 out of 2. So I'm the voice of experience here. I think that people, when they see the difficulties of marriages, which are real, and when they see people who've had failed marriages, which they will see, that they lose sight of how wonderful a good marriage is, not for a year or 2, but for a lifetime. If you are married to your soulmate, I came up, John, with, I think, a really good definition of soulmate. Soulmate is your best friend for whom you also feel a strong sexual attraction. Okay, so if you're married to your soulmate, this is a source of satisfaction and happiness that will last you until you're separated by death.
Final question. Point number 34. Watch Groundhog Day repeatedly. What's Groundhog Day and why should people watch it?
It's a 1993 movie, Bill Murray, Andie MacDowell. It's a brilliant moral fable. Don't watch it the first time saying, I'm going to watch a brilliant moral fable. Watch it because it's great entertainment, really funny and smart. But it is also telling how a real jerk in the beginning of the movie, egocentric and self-indulgent, ends up a fully realized human being. And if you watch it the second time, you'll learn more. Third time, you'll learn more. Or you can go read Aristotle's Ethics. It's your choice. Either one will lead you to pretty much the same view on virtue.
The author is Charles Murray. The book is The Curmudgeon's Guide to Getting Ahead. Do's and don'ts of right behavior, tough thinking, clear writing, and living a good life. Thanks for listening. This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Roger Kimball, who has written a new foreword to Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. Roger, who was Richard Weaver, and why do we need a new edition of this book, which was originally published in 1948?
Right, John. Well, Richard Weaver is a name from the past, probably not much known today, but he should be better known than he is. He was once very famous in the 50s and 60s. He was a name to conjure with. He was part of the National Review Circle. He was part of, he taught at the University of Chicago for his entire career. He was part of that whole Southern agrarian contingent that reintroduced a species of romanticism to American intellectual life. And probably this book, which, as you mentioned, was published in 48, this was the book that really catapulted him to fame. And there are multiple ironies about that. I think personally that a large part of the book's success had to do with its title, which may seem unassuming. I mean, ideas have consequences. Well, yeah, sure, so what? It's a truth, but it's a truth that everyone sort of recognizes. But somehow, when it was published in the great flush of post-World War II prosperity, this book, which was a salvo against the dangers of materialism and the superficiality of a culture given over to momentary distractions and gadgets and cars and radios and, well, not television yet, but all of the comforts of modern life, it struck a chord. It struck a chord, and it's interesting. It's interesting to note that Weaver himself hated the title. He wanted to call the book "The Adverse Descent," which somehow I think would not have had quite the same resonance in the marketplace as Ideas Have Consequences. But his editor at the University of Chicago prevailed. The book was published, and he became a celebrity, more or less overnight. Now, Richard Weaver he's a curious character. He died very young. He's born in 1910, died in 1963, so he only lived 53 years, which seems younger and younger to me, I can tell you. And he had a deep impression on a whole generation of thinkers and writers, not least Bill Buckley, actually. He was Bill's colleague, Wilmore Kendall, called him the captain of the anti-socialist brigade. And why was that? Well, I think that when you pick through the curiosities in this book and the curiosities in all of Weaver's writings, the thing that really impresses you, or impressed me anyway, was his insight that, as he puts it, not in this book, but in a later lecture that he gave to the Young Americans for Freedom Foundation just a year before he died in 1962. He said that history unvaryingly shows that when the people's freedom disappears, it goes not with a bang, but in silence, amid the comfort of being cared for. And it was that Tocquevillian insight that he had, that there's an element in democracy, or at least the perversion of democracy, what Tocqueville calls democratic despotism, where people hand over their freedom to a centralized state authority. It was that insight, I think, that gives his work continued relevance and makes this book really a kind of a book for the ages, because the threat of a new statism is certainly with us today in a way in which it may never have been before. And a good antidote to that renewed statism, I think, is Richard Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences. So I think that the time indeed is ripe for a new edition of this modern classic, and I for one, am delighted that the University of Chicago has seen fit to bring it out.
I love the first sentence of the book. It's this. This is another book about the dissolute West. Just like a lot of books. A lot of books over time could have started that way. But that's the first sentence. When you read this book, Roger, does it feel like a book from 1948, from olden times, from before we were born, or is there still a kind of freshness to it?
Well, I think both things, John. You know, it is a period piece. There's no doubt about that. But at least when I read it, I kept saying, "Gosh, he's right. That's right." I have to say that my little shocks of recognition and agreement were also punctuated by kind of harumphs of well, that's sort of silly, isn't it? I mean, there is this book is it's not an anti-modernist book. It's an anti-modern book. Richard Weaver was very unhappy with the modern age, and like many valuable books, many invaluable books, there are things that one will disagree with in it. I mean, I do a little anecdote that he bought his mother a farm after he became successful, and he would go and visit her every summer. And he insisted that she have the fields plowed with a horse or a mule, not a tractor, because he thought that tractors introduced a modern element to the whole situation, which was unacceptable. Now, that's kind of nice for Richard Weaver, but what about his poor mother having to oversee the horses and mules and so on? And there's a kind of, let's call it romantic, and both the positive and negative senses of romantic. Positive because it seems kind of brave and stalwart, but sort of silly too, because it tokens the romantic impulse is also an impulse that doesn't recognize reality for what they are. And you have both elements in Richard Weaver. So it's a book, I think it's a very good antidote to modern complacency. It assumes that every technological innovation is going to be for the better. Richard Weaver has a sort of blanket rejection of modernity, or at least a pretended rejection of modernity. But at the same time, he tells us something I think we need to hear. The book and the man were a kind of congeries of contradictions and conflicting passions. I mean, how odd that the person who wrote this anti-modern book would teach at the University of Chicago, than which there was no more committed institution to the principles. This was the institution where they split the atom. So there's a lot of tensions and contradictions in Weaver, but I think it's a voice that very much needs to be heard today in our modern complacency and our slip toward that statism. Amid the comfort of being cared for, as Weaver put it, it's a necessary book, in my opinion.
He famously thought, or semi-famously thought, that everything went wrong with William of Ockham in the 14th century. And in your foreword to this new expanded edition, you say this is both accurate and comical.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's accurate in the sense that he's not the first person to point out that in the doctrine of nominalism, you get many of the seeds that made the modern world possible. For example, the seeds of that view of nature, which is not instinct with God anymore, but which is, as Descartes put it, is kind of an extended realm that is fit for the intervention of human ingenuity. So that is accurate, but it's also silly or preposterous, because to say that our modern problems are the fault of, or can be laid at the feet of, William of Ockham or of nominalism in the Middle Ages is kind of a prescription for futility, really. So it's both accurate and comical. I remember a friend of mine once called me up late at night and said, Roger, actually his first words were, "The rot began with Plato." What can you say? Well, maybe it did, but that's what's the proper response?
I think I'll take my stand. I'll take my stand with William of Ockham and modern dentistry. Thank you. We're running out of time. We've got about a minute to go, Roger. But tell us about this expanded edition. What does that mean? What's new, and why should someone want this edition from the University of Chicago? This brand new edition of
right. Well, of course, there is that incomparable forward that you mentioned by yours truly. One wouldn't want to be without that. But there's also a very useful afterword, which talks about how the book came to be written by Ted Smith. So it's a book. It's an edition that has little aids to the reader, telling you about Richard Weaver, placing the book in the context of our intellectual, political, spiritual itinerary. So I think that if you're going to read this book, and I hope your listeners do, this would be the edition to get.
Our guest is Roger Kimball, the author of a new foreword to Ideas Have Consequences by Richard M. Weaver. Thanks for listening. This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Richard Epstein, author of The Classical Liberal Constitution, The Uncertain Quest for Limited Government. Richard, what do you mean by classical liberalism, and how is the U.S. Constitution classically liberal?
Okay. Well, I think the easiest way to do it is to make this a middle position between two extremes. The one which is easy to reject is the sort of the socialist or the social democratic version, in which there's heavy government involvement in the ownership or the regulation of the means of production and consumption. On the other end is the sort of pure libertarian position, which is deeply suspicious of trying to put together collective solutions through government coercion. The classical liberal breaks, therefore, from the libertarian in two ways. One is it's quite clear that taxation is a legitimate part of the classical liberal constitution, and the major effort is to figure out how it is that you discipline the power of the state when it taxes in ways that prevent various kinds of political abuse, but still allows the government to raise whatever revenue target it needs. And whether you start with Aristotle or Locke or go through Hayek and so forth, almost all classical liberals have two beliefs on this. One is that you want single instruments of taxation, because if you multiply them for general revenue purposes, you just get too much discretion. And secondly, the best is off a very broad base, either it be income or consumption, and that the rate be flat over the full range of situations. And the second feature of a classical liberal constitution is it recognizes that there's serious holdout problems when you're trying to assemble land, say, for a railroad and so forth, and so that it explicitly authorizes in its own constitution condemnation for public use upon payment of just compensation, which is the formula that's found in the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Libertarians have a lot of trouble with taxes, and they have a lot of trouble with dealing with the forced exchanges. I might add that these are not minor adjustments to a libertarian position. They're very major changes, and they basically make it possible for government to operate, but unless you police them carefully, they become serious sources of abuse. And when I talk about the unlimited, the uncertain quest for limited government, it's that sometimes we lose sight of the need to both have these institutions and to regulate them, and so that in certain areas our Constitution seems to follow strong limited government principles, but is construed by the Supreme Court more recently. In many cases, it deviates sharply from them.
So were America's founding fathers classical liberals?
Well, they didn't call themselves classical liberals because the term only came into being after the original rays of liberalism passed. That is, the 19th century version of liberalism was a kind of an Adam Smith small natural liberty type government and so forth. But when liberal became co-opted as a term for sort of major left-wing interventions, classical liberal was put back in to sort of make it clear that we were hearkening back to an earlier era. But if you then look at the particular provisions of the Constitution and ask whether or not they match up with this classical liberal vision, the answer is in its essentials, yes. The limited government, divided government, federalism, limits on the tax power, limits on the eminent domain power, enumerated powers, all of these are efforts to check what government can do without making it impossible for it to discharge its classical and necessary functions. So you can find clauses in the Constitution which are decidedly anti-everything, the 3/5 clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and so forth. But the provisions that, in fact, have lasted and the ones that give it its distinctive greatness are not these sops to Southerners in order to get the Constitution started, but are, in fact, the basic architecture of the Constitution as it came down to us today.
Yeah, you say we've gotten away from this vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happened, and why did it happen, and when did it happen?
Well, I mean, this is a gradual process of erosion, but if you had to pick the most dramatic point, it would, of course, be the Supreme Court October 1936 term, culminating in a large number of decisions in the spring and summer of 1937, all of which seemed to cast to the wind's most little limitations. So with respect to the commerce power, instead of being a power which allowed the government to regulate commerce, that is, transportation and communication across state lines, it was reconstrued to be far broader and to allow you to regulate manufacture, agriculture, and mining within the states simply because they have some effects on what goes on in other states. This was well understood in the 19th century, and the theory had always been rejected. But come 1937, with the pressures of the New Deal and the need to validate the agricultural statutes on the one hand and the labor statutes on the other, the Supreme Court buckled by a 5-4 vote. I might add that these things are largely catastrophic in their implications. The term is perhaps a bit strong, but not all that much, because what it did is it ushered the United States government into a new business, namely the formation of cartels on the one hand by people in agriculture and in labor, and in the suppression of competition and the organization of markets in other industries like motor vehicles. So that was the first feature. The second feature is the decline of the doctrine of economic liberties. Economic liberties was essentially a proposition which says that people are ordinarily entitled to sell their labor at whatever price and whatever wage they want in ordinary occupation. So ordinary liberty doesn't include the right to become a member of a gangster conspiracy, but it does include a right to say, I'll take a job for $2 an hour, even if the state says you have to take it for $3. But when they decided to support minimum wage laws, overtime laws, mandatory unions, and so forth, all the economic liberty stuff dropped to the end. And if you take the modern illustration, something like Obamacare, it is such a massive infringement upon ordinary economic rights that it cries out for some intervention on those grounds. And yet, when the case came before the courts, there was no serious scholar who thought that you could win on economic liberties or substantive due process grounds. So you've got these rather bizarre Commerce Clause challenges and Taxation Clause challenges. They ultimately failed, and you see the wreckage which is now in place by virtue of the foolish and ultimately disastrous efforts to try to implement this program through administrative action.
A conservative listening to that explanation, I can imagine nodding along in agreeing with everything you say. Does that mean that the classical liberals and conservatives are united, or do you have a critique of conservative constitutionalism as well?
Oh, I have a fairly strong critique of conservative constitutionalism, chiefly with respect to the doctrines of judicial restraint, especially as they're embodied in the rules of standing. The conservatives essentially agree with me in terms of desired forms of economic regulation, but they don't believe that there's anything in the Constitution which dictates those results. The most forceful defendant of that position was the late Bob Bork, who thought that Lochner against New York, which struck down the maximum hour laws, was the incarnation of evil as a matter of judicial decision. I think it's a perfectly natural implication from the general classical liberal positions. On standing issues, starting with conservative judges, mainly Sutherland back in 1921 in a case called Massachusetts against Mellon, they essentially made it impossible for a citizen or a taxpayer to challenge any spending program of the United States. And once spending programs could be challenged by judicial means, they will simply run riot. So these are conservative decisions which were in the honor of judicial constraint, but they contributed enormously to the untoward expansion of government. And as we look around today and see all the battles over Medicare and Medicaid and various other kinds of social programs, there's a serious question as to whether or not our current institutions are sustainable, and there's nothing that the judiciary will do at this point to intervene against the kinds of political excesses. Lawrence Silverman, a very fine job, once said national problems need national solutions, so national problems must go to Congress. The problem, of course, is that the national problem is Congress, and we cannot trust it to regulate itself.
Looking at the 9 justices who sit on the Supreme Court today, are any of them classical liberals, or are they close to classical liberals with whom you can mostly agree?
No, I think the closest would probably be Justice Thomas, but I think he's driven more by a view of constitutional textual interpretation than by an overarching political theory, which he then uses to explain and explicate key constitutional provisions. And there is no question that it's erratic on certain kinds of issues like the Dormant Commerce Clause, very powerful classical liberal implications, and virtually all 9 justices in one form or another, with the exception perhaps of Thomas and Scalia, subscribe to the fact that the Dormant Commerce Clause, that is, the inability of states to block commerce even when the federal government is not regulated, most of them tend to be very good on that. On First Amendment issues, generally speaking, they're largely classical liberal, although there's an important break on this. The conservatives, I think, have been much more libertarian with respect to campaign financing than the liberals, who have been just dreadful on this particular issue. So I think that that's an area in which you see some classical liberal implications. But with respect to economic regulation, it's dumb and dumber, or worse and worse, whatever you wish to say. There is no serious sustained movement to strike down various kinds of economic regulation today. The court says it's too hard, we don't have the particular knowledge, the role doesn't belong to us, and all the rest. And so what happens is the liberals support this legislation, and so forth, therefore cheerleading to make sure that it's sustained, and the conservatives essentially believe that it's not their institutional role. So for different reasons, there's pretty much a 9-0 coalition on the Supreme Court today in defense of what I regard as highly dangerous social kinds of positions. The rise of subsidies, the rise of cartels, the rise of barriers to entry in all sorts of industries is essentially largely traceable to the fact that the Supreme Court has fallen asleep at the switch when it comes to the protection of property rights and economic liberties.
The author is Richard Epstein. The book is The Classical Liberal Constitution, The Uncertain Quest for Limited Government. Thanks for listening. This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Richard Epstein, author of The Classical Liberal Constitution, The Uncertain Quest for Limited Government. Richard, what do you mean by classical liberalism, and how is the U.S. Constitution classically liberal?
Okay. Well, I think the easiest way to do it is to make this a middle position between two extremes. The one which is easy to reject is the sort of the socialist or the social democratic version, in which there's heavy government involvement in the ownership or the regulation of the means of production and consumption. On the other end, there's the sort of pure libertarian position, which is deeply suspicious of trying to put together collective solutions through government coercion. The classical liberal breaks, therefore, from the libertarian in two ways. One is it's quite clear that taxation is a legitimate part of the classical liberal constitution, and the major effort is to figure out how it is that you discipline the power of the state when it taxes in ways that prevent various kinds of political abuse, but still allows the government to raise whatever revenue target it needs. Now, whether you start with Aristotle or Locke or go through Hayek and so forth, almost all classical liberals have two beliefs on this. One is that you want single instruments of taxation, because if you multiply them for general revenue purposes, you just get too much discretion. And secondly, the best is off a very broad base, either it be income or consumption, and that the rate be flat over the full range of situations. And the second feature of a classical liberal constitution is it recognizes that there are serious holdout problems when you're trying to assemble land, say, for a railroad and so forth, and so that it explicitly authorizes in its own constitution condemnation for public use upon payment of just compensation, which is the formula that's found in the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Libertarians have a lot of trouble with taxes, and they have a lot of trouble with dealing with the forced exchanges. I might add that these are not minor adjustments to a libertarian position. They're very major changes, and they basically make it possible for government to operate, but unless you police them carefully, they become serious sources of abuse. And when I talk about the unlimited, the uncertain quest for limited government, it's that sometimes we lose sight of the need to both have these institutions and to regulate them, and so that in certain areas our Constitution seems to follow strong limited government principles, but is construed by the Supreme Court more recently. In many cases, it deviates sharply from them.
So were America's founding fathers classical liberals?
Well, they didn't call themselves classical liberals because the term only came into being after the original rays of liberalism passed. That is, the 19th century version of liberalism was a kind of an Adam Smith small natural liberty type government and so forth. But when liberal became co-opted as a term for sort of major left-wing interventions, classical liberal was put back in to sort of make it clear that we were hearkening back to an earlier era. But if you then look at the particular provisions of the Constitution and ask whether or not they match up with this classical liberal vision, the answer is in its essentials, yes. The limited government, divided government, federalism, limits on the tax power, limits on the eminent domain power, enumerated powers, all of these are efforts to check what government can do without making it impossible for it to discharge its classical and necessary functions. So you can find clauses in the Constitution which are decidedly anti-everything, the 3/5 clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and so forth. But the provisions that, in fact, have lasted and the ones that give it its distinctive greatness are not these sops to Southerners in order to get the Constitution started, but are, in fact, the basic architecture of the Constitution as it came down to us today.
Yeah, you say we've gotten away from this vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happened, and why did it happen, and when did it happen?
Well, I mean, this is a gradual process of erosion, but if you had to pick the most dramatic point, it would, of course, be the Supreme Court October 1936 term, culminating in a large number of decisions in the spring and summer of 1937, all of which seemed to cast to the winds most of the limitations. So with respect to the commerce power, instead of being a power which allowed the government to regulate commerce, that is, transportation and communication across state lines, it was reconstrued to be far broader and to allow you to regulate manufacture, agriculture, and mining within the states simply because they have some effects on what goes on in other states. This was well understood in the 19th century, and the theory had always been rejected. But come 1937, with the pressures of the New Deal and the need to validate the agricultural statutes on the one hand and the labor statutes on the other, the Supreme Court buckled by a 5-4 vote. I might add that these things are largely catastrophic in their implications. The term is perhaps a bit strong, but not all that much, because what it did is it ushered the United States government into a new business, namely the formation of cartels on the one hand by people in agriculture and in labor, and in the suppression of competition and the organization of markets in other industries like motor vehicles. So that was the first feature. The second feature is the decline of the doctrine of economic liberties. Economic liberties was essentially a proposition which says that people are ordinarily entitled to sell their labor at whatever price and whatever wage they want in ordinary occupation. So ordinary liberty doesn't include the right to become a member of a gangster conspiracy, but it does include a right to say, I'll take a job for $2 an hour, even if the state says you have to take it for $3. But when they decided to support minimum wage laws, overtime laws, mandatory unions, and so forth, all the economic liberty stuff dropped to the end. And if you take the modern illustration, something like Obamacare, it is such a massive infringement upon ordinary economic rights that it cries out for some intervention on those grounds. And yet, when the case came before the courts, there was no serious scholar who thought that you could win on economic liberties or substantive due process grounds. So you got these rather bizarre commerce clause challenges and taxation clause challenges. They ultimately failed, and you see the wreckage which is now in place by virtue of the foolish and ultimately disastrous efforts to try to implement this program through administrative action.
A conservative listening to that explanation, I can imagine nodding along in agreeing with everything you say. Does that mean that the classical liberals and conservatives are united, or do you have a critique of conservative constitutionalism as well?
Oh, I have a fairly strong critique of conservative constitutionalism, chiefly with respect to the doctrines of judicial restraint, especially as they're embodied in the rules of standing. The conservatives essentially agree with me in terms of desired forms of economic regulation, but they don't believe that there's anything in the Constitution which dictates those results. The most forceful defendant of that position was the late Bob Bork, who thought that Lochner against New York, which struck down the maximum hour laws, was the incarnation of evil as a matter of judicial decision. I think it's a perfectly natural implication from the general classical liberal positions. On standing issues, starting with conservative judges, mainly Sutherland back in 1921 in a case called Massachusetts against Mellon, they essentially made it impossible for a citizen or a taxpayer to challenge any spending program of the United States. And once spending programs could be challenged by judicial means, they will simply run riot. So these are conservative decisions which were in the honor of judicial constraint, but they contributed enormously to the untoward expansion of government. And as we look around today and see all the battles over Medicare and Medicaid and various other kinds of social programs, there's a serious question as to whether or not our current institutions are sustainable, and there's nothing that the judiciary will do at this point to intervene against the kinds of political excesses. Lawrence Silberman, a very fine job, once said national problems need national solutions, so national problems must go to Congress. The problem, of course, is that the national problem is Congress, and we cannot trust it to regulate itself.
Looking at the 9 justices who sit on the Supreme Court today, are any of them classical liberals, or are they close to classical liberals with whom you can mostly agree?
No, I think the closest would probably be Justice Thomas, but I think he's driven more by a view of constitutional textual interpretation than by an overarching political theory, which he then uses to explain and explicate key constitutional provisions. And there is no question that it's erratic on certain kinds of issues, like the Dormant Commerce Clause, very powerful classical liberal implications, and virtually all 9 justices in one form or another, with the exception perhaps of Thomas and Scalia, subscribe to the fact that the Dormant Commerce Clause, that is, the inability of states to block commerce even when the federal government is not regulated, most of them tend to be very good on that. On First Amendment issues, generally speaking, they are largely classical liberal, although there's an important break on this. The conservatives, I think, have been much more libertarian with respect to campaign financing than the liberals, who have been just dreadful on this particular issue. So I think that that's an area in which you see some classical liberal implications. But with respect to economic regulation, it's dumb and dumber, or worse and worse, whatever you wish to say. There is no serious sustained movement to strike down various kinds of economic regulation today. The court says it's too hard, we don't have the particular knowledge, the role doesn't belong to us, and all the rest. And so what happens is the liberals support this legislation, and so forth, therefore cheerleading to make sure that it's sustained, and the conservatives essentially believe that it's not their institutional role. So for different reasons, there's pretty much a 9-0 coalition on the Supreme Court today in defense of what I regard as highly dangerous social kinds of positions. The rise of subsidies, the rise of cartels, the rise of barriers to entry in all sorts of industries is essentially largely traceable to the fact that the Supreme Court has fallen asleep at the switch when it comes to the protection of property rights and economic liberties.
The author is Richard Epstein. The book is The Classical Liberal Constitution, The Uncertain Quest for Limited Government. Thanks for listening. This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Louisa Lim, author of The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. Louisa, what happened 25 years ago at Tiananmen Square in China?
Well, 25 years ago, there was a massive uprising, a series of protests that really convulsed the whole of China for 7 weeks. It started off as a student movement, but it really turned into a mass movement. The demands were for more democracy and more freedom, but also for action against corruption, profiteering, abuse of power, and this demands like that. And on the night of June the 3rd to June the 4th, the Communist Party sent in tanks and sent in martial law troops into the center of Beijing, 150,000 martial law troops, to clear the square. And even to this day, we don't know how many people died, but many people were killed along the way when they opened fire at unarmed civilians. The initial figures said the government claimed 241 people died, but the number is much higher, possibly in the thousands.
Explain the title of your book, The People's Republic of Amnesia.
Well, I've called it the People's Republic of Amnesia because I think the Communist Party has done a remarkable job at really deleting the events of June the 4th, 1989, and in fact the whole movement from the collective memory. There's been a very systematic effort. To begin with, they started rewriting history. So immediately after the crackdown, the government started flooding the information space with its own version of events, that this was a counter-revolutionary riot aimed at bringing down the Communist Party with the help of hostile international forces. And that's the version that is taught today, if it is taught at all. Actually, you will find no mention of 1989, of the events of 1989 in school textbooks, very little in university textbooks. It's never mentioned in the newspapers, even online. If you type in June the 4th, just that, June the 4th, it will be censored. And even the kind of code that people use to try and talk about June the 4th, like saying May the 35th instead of June the 4th, that gets deleted too. So it's really an event that has been forgotten. The memory has been repressed in China, and that's why I call it, and it's been very successful, that's why I called it the People's Republic of Amnesia.
A great iconic image from those days is the Tank Man, the photograph of this guy, this ordinary looking guy facing down a column of tanks. What do we know about the Tank Man? Who is he, or was he? And do the Chinese people know the image the way we in the West know that image?
So still today, there's a great deal which is unknown about the Tank Man. We don't know what his name is. We don't know what happened to him, even. If you watch the footage, you'll see that not only did he face down the tanks, he actually climbed up onto the leading tank and exchanged words with the soldier inside that tank. And afterwards, he was bundled off by 3 people, one on a bicycle. It's not clear whether it was for his own protection or that he was being detained. But in the following year, Barbara Walters actually asked the then President, Jiang Zemin, what had happened to the man we call Tank Man. And he told her he thought that he was still alive, but he didn't seem to know. So there's a lot that's unknown. And it is a completely iconic image in the West, but in China, especially among the young people, very few people actually can identify it. And I took the picture to Beijing's top 4 universities, those that were most instrumental in the 1989 protests, and I showed it to 100 students and asked them to identify it, and only 15 out of that 100 knew what it was. The 85 others really, it was quite clear they had no idea.
Now, you also write in this book not just about Tiananmen, but also what happened in at least one other city in China around the same time. What happened there, and why haven't we heard about it before?
That was the question that really baffled me. When I started doing research about this, I was just completely bowled over that such, big events had happened outside Beijing that simply hadn't been reported on. So this was in the city of Chengdu in southwestern China, more than 1,000 miles from Beijing. And they had a student movement there, and it was huge as well, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And then when it came to June the 4th, more people took to the streets to protest against the killings in Beijing. And it really led to 3 days of sort of street battles with the authorities. And even the government figures said that 8 people died, 1,800 people were injured. But eyewitnesses who were there feel that figure is far too low. And there was one particular incident, a very, very brutal incident, where a lot of eyewitnesses saw people being very brutally beaten in a hotel car park and bodies being slung onto 2 trucks and driven away. And, that this should happen and not be reported on at all was astonishing to me. I mean, I think, there were no foreign media there, so that was one factor. And I think a lot of the foreign witnesses who saw what happened were repatriated to their home countries very quickly afterwards. So although they tried to get the word out, and many of them went to the press and went to Amnesty International, I think the events in Beijing were so huge and so overwhelming that they really swamped everything else. And little notice was paid of what happened outside the capital.
What is the state of political freedom in China today? And how do you, as a foreign journalist, go about your work? When you're in China, are you able to report on anything, or do you have to deal with censorship all the time?
Well, there's no way that the authorities can censor us as foreign journalists working in China, although occasionally they do try. And we've been hearing reports over the last few days that foreign journalists are actually being warned not to go to Tiananmen Square over the anniversary, or there will be unspecified consequences. So occasionally they try, but most of the time they don't actually censor our work. What they do is restrict access to dissidents, people who they perceive as problematic by, putting them under surveillance or even under house arrest. So when I was writing this book, there were several people who I talked to who were under quite strict surveillance. So there was one very high-profile dissident who used to be one of the most senior officials in China, but after Tiananmen, he spent 7 years in jail because he was supporting the liberal party leader at the time, Zhao Ziyang. So he was really on the wrong side of the leadership struggle. Anyway, when I would go and interview him, we would meet in a McDonald's close to his house, and he was always followed everywhere by a team of watchers who would sort of sit across the restaurant and watch us. And, this is the way that he lives his life. And he has, ever since he left jail, so for the past 17 years, and, I actually asked him once, I said, what is it like being watched all the time? And he said, I'm so used to it. If they weren't here, I feel lonely now. So, I think for the vast majority of the population, life is a lot freer than it was in 1989. People no longer need government permission to, find jobs and to get married and to apply for a passport and to study overseas and those kind of things. But when it comes to these very, very sensitive issues like what happened in 1989, then the situation hasn't changed that much. Those people who dare to speak out, they are watched very closely and punished as well. This year we've seen dozens of people detained or placed under house arrest or simply disappeared in order to stop them from talking about Tiananmen and in order to stop them from commemorating it, even behind closed doors. So I think that shows how scared the government is of the memory of Tiananmen Square and of June the 4th, 1989.
The author is Louisa Lim. The book is The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. Thanks for listening. This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Joseph Bottum, author of An Anxious Age, The Post-Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of America. Jody, what is the post-Protestant ethic?
It's a set of understandings of the social order and the political order inherited by the descendants of the mainline Protestant churches that in various forms dominated America for most of its history. And these are visions of moral issues that have taken on a kind of social issues that have taken on a kind of supernatural being. As these people fled from the churches and their children now have never been to church, they've discovered that the spiritual anxiety of the age is satisfied for them only if in the area of politics.
Now you say spiritual anxiety of the age. The book, of course, is called An Anxious Age. But what is anxious our time?
Well, I think what's anxious about our time is what is anxious about many other times. Sociology, the real discipline of sociology, the academic discipline of it, started with analysis of religion. It's Emil Durkheim's book on suicide that compares suicide rates among various groups, religious groups. And it reaches its peak in Max Weber's famous book, whose title is echoed in my subtitle, The Spirit of the Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And what we lost since Weber is this concept that spiritual anxiety, this desperate desire to know that you're saved, to be confirmed that you're a good person, has real impact on the culture and on society. And as the Protestant churches, the mainline Protestant churches faded, it set loose that anxiety to know that you're a good person, to know that you're saved in a Christian vocabulary. And these people that I'm describing are seeking some way to know their own goodness. And they find it through a complicated path that I trace through the social gospel movement. They find it in their political attitudes towards certain things conceived of as evils that exist in the world. Like,
so how does this manifest itself in politics right now? This impulse to seek salvation through politics. What does that mean in terms of elections and the political scene today?
Well, it starts here, and then it echoes all the way down. It starts with the vision that your political opponents are not merely mistaken, but actually evil. And
now that's a loaded word, evil.
Right, but that's, if you think about how, say, hard environmentalists think about their opponents, they think that they are not merely mistaken, they think that they are positive forces of evil. Or imagine, or listen to the way, here's a perfect example, listen to the way Chris Matthews on television uses the word racism. It's not a sin exactly. It's not something that people do necessarily. It's some dark miasmatic cloud that hangs over the world, hangs over the whole of the past and over certain classes today, social classes, of course, other than Chris Matthews. And it hangs over them and it darkens everything they do. And the people who don't the light, who haven't been enlightened, who haven't been saved, they don't understand that they are participating in evil.
Now, your argument would seem to fly in the face of another claim, which we hear all the time from conservatives, which is we live in a time of moral relativism. In other words, a reluctance to make moral claims and almost a denial of absolute moral truths. You seem to be saying that there's actually something else going on.
Oh, I think the first, let me think of the right way to put this. I analyzed two classes in the book. I would have loved to do more, but I take up two sociological groups. The first is the mostly left-wing, college-educated class that ever since Christopher Lasch wrote, we've all run around calling the elites. And the second is the Catholics reared up under the papacy of John Paul II. And that relatively small group of serious, highly intellectualized Catholics. And those are the two sociological groups that I like. But I think all of them, but particularly the elite, are formed by this desire to know that they're good people, and even though they sometimes speak in the language of relativism, in fact, they're highly puritanical and highly moralistic. They don't think of themselves as moralistic or puritanical, but they are perfectly willing to use law to compel manners in certain areas, like Mayor Bloomberg banning large glasses of or large cups of soda. And they're perfectly willing to do this. They don't think of themselves as Puritans because they think of Puritanism entirely in terms of sex. And about sex, they've removed that from the moral realm. But about everything else, these people are enormously moralistic. However much they speak the language of relativism, they are not relativists at all.
Now, you use this term post-Protestant, suggests we kind of live in a post. Are you saying that we live in a post-Protestant time? And I looked up a statistic from the Pew folks on this. 51% of Americans identify themselves as Protestants. So take that for what it's worth. But are you saying that we're in a post-Protestant or maybe even a post-Christian era in the United States?
Well, it's possible that this is where liberal Protestantism was always headed. Now, there are plenty of Protestants in the world, or in the United States, if you're going to define Protestantism under its theological terms. But Protestantism in America also always had a social context, and it was that these certain mainline churches, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Disciples of Christ, and so on, that these were the center of American culture. The high water mark is reached in 1965, when just over 50% of America belongs to one of these 7 churches. Today, the number is under 10%. The Disciples of Christ were once 3 or 4% of the American population. They're now under 600,000 of them. The average age of a Congregationalist in the UCC is 65. So when I talk about the collapse of Protestantism, I mean the collapse of the mainstream of what we used to call the main line, what Tocqueville called the undivided current of a kind of central liberal Protestantism.
And so you're saying that at the same time there can be a kind of resiliency to Christianity in the culture, just not this one strain of Protestantism.
Right, and it manifests itself in the elite, who are, maybe the best way to understand them is they're Episcopalians without any God. Right, or without any church. Now, they have all the social attributes of the old Episcopalians who thought they were the absolute center of America.
Is President Obama the natural product of this movement?
Oh, he's an ideal example. Although nominally he belongs to a Methodist church. He attends services, and I don't want to question his faith. But in his attitudes, he is, and the laws, and his impatience with the democratic process, and his utter conviction that he and his ilk are the center of America and represent not some extreme view, but the moral center of all that is right. In all of that, he is the perfect product of this post-Protestantism.
Will we escape this age of anxiety? Will a generation from now, will we be thinking we no longer live in an age of anxiety, that something new and different has come along? What do you see for the future?
Well, the book itself, this is purely diagnostic. I mean, I think, I really have to work out where I think we ought to go from here. And this book is an attempt to say, realistically, where are we? For 200 years, these churches were a central prop of the American experiment, and they're gone now. And what happens next? I mean, we saw one of the things that happened, which is the 2 largest Christian groups on either side of the main line, the Catholics and the evangelicals, who had always been excluded, kind of got sucked into the whole. And we had a decade of that evangelicals and Catholics together project before it failed. But where we go, and now that it's failed, and the post-Protestants have assumed the cultural places that their grandparents had, what do we do now? I'm not sure, but it's a very dangerous time.
Maybe that's your next book. The author is Joseph Bottum. The book is An Anxious Age, The Post-Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of America. Thanks for listening. This is John J. Miller of National Review Online. Thanks for listening. Our guest is Bert Folsom, co-author with Anita Folsom of Uncle Sam Can't Count, a history of failed government initiatives from Beaver Pelts to green energy. Bert, when did the government invest in Beaver Pelts, and what happened?
It was under George Washington. We've had corporate subsidies, what we sometimes call crony capitalism, from the time of George Washington up to Barack Obama. And George Washington wanted to protect the United States from British encroachment after the Revolutionary War. And as president, he funded a federal fur company to trade with the Indians. It was a disaster. In fact, the British made inroads under that fur company. It had unintended consequences of actually encouraging British encroachment rather than preventing it.
So was George Washington, our great founding father, was George Washington a central planner and a crony capitalist?
Well, he was in that instance. I think he was a great president. But in that instance, he fell prey to the idea that if you have a problem, if you fund a business or some person to stop the problem, that the problem is likely to be stopped. That was really the first lesson in United States history, that doesn't work. We went on to have failure after failure, but Washington got the process started, despite the fact that the Constitution is very clear in forbidding, in Article 1, Section 8, forbidding these kinds of subsidies.
You write about another founding father in the introduction to this book, and that's President Thomas Jefferson, who started the National Road Project. Explain what happened there, and then the obvious question is, shouldn't the government build roads and basic infrastructure?
No, that's a good question, John. Thomas Jefferson got that process started with what was called the National Road. The idea was we had just gotten this Louisiana Purchase land from France, and now we had to try to get settlers inside that. And the idea was if we had a big road that was funded by the government, maybe that would be a good way to get people in there, without realizing that people are naturally going to come in depending on the attractions of the farmland and that kind of thing. They were coming anyway. But the National Road ended up being a political boondoggle, which went through particular congressmen's districts back east, and then it was so poorly constructed once it got into the west and into the new territory that nearby farmers and others just stole pieces of the road. Nobody owned it, so nobody had a stake in preserving it. It was done constitutionally to deliver the mail, but it was such a poor deliverer of the mail that people along the National Road hired private couriers to deliver the mail because it couldn't be done on the National Road built by the government.
Are government investments, whatever they're in, from Beaver Pelts to the National Road to green energy today, are government investments always a bad idea?
I would say just about always, John. We might find a few exceptions here and there, but they're very, very remote. If you look at the major industries in the United States, steamships, railroads, airplanes with the Wright brothers, we saw subsidies, well, in the case of the Wright brothers, subsidy of Samuel Langley to build the airplane. We felt we needed it, again, for national defense. Emergency is often the excuse for a subsidy. The man we subsidized, Samuel Langley, built an airplane that flew, it had two flights, twice going into the Potomac River. 9 days after the second one failed, all with government money. 9 days later, the Wright brothers, two bicycle mechanics with $2,000 of their own money, made the first flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
What's an example of a government investment that worked? One that comes to mind, for me anyway, is the Erie Canal. That seems to have been a good idea.
Well, it sort of seems that way, doesn't it? And we have a chapter on that because it is such an important example. It was the Erie Canal was the example used by politicians and other leaders in the 1800s as an example of a subsidy that worked. Here you had the state of New York. It wasn't a federal subsidy, by the way. It was a state subsidy, so it was very much constitutional. But it was state-funded, not privately funded. And so the state of New York built that up the Hudson River from New York City all the way out west of Buffalo. And it jacked right away. So it seemed like a good idea. Other states copied it, and in every case, Pennsylvania, Michigan, by the way, also in Illinois, other states that copied that all failed. Those canals and publicly funded railroads all failed. The reason the New York Erie Canal seems to have succeeded was because the river system was good, the topography was very good for connecting those rivers, and therefore it was it was no-brainer. It would have been done more successfully, I think, privately. And here's the important point, John. Because it was done by the state of New York, they had to get state politicians to do the Erie Canal. And in the process of doing that, they made commitments to build other canals in the state of New York. They had 8 other canals, all of which failed, and lost more money than the Erie Canal generated. And so the state of New York, ultimately, with its canal system, lost money.
What about the space program? That's another government investment that seems to have worked. We put a man on the moon, Bert.
Well, no, that's a good example, too, and it starts out, I would say that's a good example. Some people have cited the atomic bomb making it as an example. I think both of those two have possibilities, and we mentioned both of those in the book. But notice in those cases, we have very limited kind of what I would call political entrepreneurship. In other words, you're not picking someone and giving that person a subsidy. You are, in effect, you're getting a team of people together, and you're recruiting the best out of that team. And also, there's a crisis atmosphere in both of those cases. I mean, a genuine crisis atmosphere. In the case of the atomic bomb, you have World War II at stake and beating the Germans. It was a secretive program. Because it was secretive, therefore you didn't have a chance for others to get in on the federal funding, and you have these political entrepreneurs trying to tap the government. And so you also had good leadership in those cases. In the case of the atomic bomb, Leslie Groves. And so what you have is occasional examples of success, and many of those successes might have been replicated in the private sector. But what you typically have is something like Obamacare or Cash for Clunkers or some program like this, which is a politicized program right from the start. It inevitably fails, and that's been the case for 200 years of our history.
So subsidies waste money. They aren't as efficient as market-driven projects in the private sector. But is that all the harm they do? They just waste money?
No, I think it's much worse than that. Let me give you a couple examples, John. Number one, they're bankrupting the country. They are the longest-running federal subsidy in American history. People complain about welfare and the waste of money in welfare. Welfare has only been a federal program, federal welfare, for 82 years. These federal subsidies here go back to George Washington. People complain about public sector unions draining cities and the nation of cash, but those have only been prominent for 40 years. These corporate subsidies go back to George Washington, and they form the basis of defending the other kinds of government interventions that have been very harmful. So the corporate subsidies bankrupt the country. They lead to other kinds of subsidies that also do harm. Stephen Moore at Heritage Foundation has recorded that since the year 2000, corporate subsidies have involved almost every major corporation in the country, and they cost the nation in the last 12 years, $3,000 a second, every second, for the last 12 years.
Bert, last question. Why is it so hard for politicians to learn the lessons you tell in the book? Why is it so hard for them to resist these kinds of investments that are almost certainly bound to fail?
Oh, I think that's a really good question. They keep failing again and again. And one reason is for political purpose. They fail economically. They cost the country money. They cost the country respect because they give the idea that other people are getting special privileges and they're not. But they're politically useful. In other words, those politicians that can create an Erie Canal, or those politicians that can give a subsidy to Langley for the airplane, or to Collins for a steamship, or to the Union Pacific for a transcontinental railroad that fails, those politicians gain votes. They appear to be active. They have a group receiving the subsidy that's making the case for it, and they gain votes by the subsidy. And because of the political element of it, they are continued generation after generation.
The author is Bert Folsom, co-author with Anita Folsom of Uncle Sam Can't Count, a history of failed government investments from beaver pelts to green energy. Thanks for listening.